The ferry rope burned through Fiona Zimmerman's calloused palms as she hauled the wooden platform across the Arkansas River, and she wondered if this would be the crossing that finally broke her back or her spirit, whichever gave out first. The morning sun cast long shadows across the water in eastern Oklahoma Territory, and the year was 1889, a time when women operating ferries were about as common as snow in July. But here she was, doing the work her father had done before a rattlesnake took him 6 months back. The passenger on this particular morning was a cowboy she had noticed before, tall and quiet, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and eyes the color of creek stones after rain. Fiona planted her boots against the wooden planks and pulled harder on the rope, her shoulders screaming with the effort. The cowboy stood beside his paint horse, one hand resting on the animal's neck, watching her work with an expression she could not quite read. He had crossed her ferry 3 times in the past week, always alone, always heading toward Tahlequah in the morning and back toward the cattle ranch in the evening. She knew the routine of most travelers by now, had memorized the patterns of their lives from these brief water crossings, but this one puzzled her. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice deep and steady like the river itself. "Name's Xander Cross. I realize I've been crossing regular without proper introductions." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak while the current fought her grip on the rope. The Arkansas was running higher than usual this spring, swollen with snowmelt from mountains she had never seen but heard about in stories. Every crossing required her full strength and concentration, leaving little energy for pleasantries. Her arms trembled as she worked the pulley system her father had rigged years ago, before she was born, back when Tahlequah was barely more than a Cherokee settlement and Oklahoma Territory was still called Indian Territory by most folks. "Fiona Zimmerman," she finally managed, her breath coming hard, "though most just call me the ferry girl." Xander stepped closer, his boots making hollow sounds on the deck. "Mind if I help with that rope? Looks like the current's giving you trouble." Pride flared hot in her chest, the same pride that had kept her operating this ferry when everyone in town said she should sell it and find a husband to take care of her. She was 22 years old enough to make her own decisions, and she had promised her father on his deathbed that she would keep the ferry running. But her arms were genuinely failing, the rope slipping inch by inch through her grip, and the middle of the Arkansas River was no place to let stubbornness drown them both. "Appreciate it," she said through gritted teeth. Xander moved beside her and grasped the rope, his hands large and scarred from ranch work. Together they hauled, and the ferry began moving more smoothly across the water. Fiona could smell leather and horse and something else, maybe sage or cedar, coming off him in waves. Up close, she could see he was young, probably not more than 25 or 26, with a face weathered by sun and wind but still handsome in a rough-hewn way. "You do this alone every day?" he asked as they pulled in rhythm. "Every day someone needs crossing," she confirmed. "Sometimes that's twice a day, sometimes 20 times. River doesn't care either way." They reached the eastern bank, and Xander helped her secure the ferry to the posts her father had driven deep into the mud years ago. His horse stepped off carefully, trained to the unsteady footing, and Xander pressed 2 coins into her palm. The standard fee was 1 coin, and she tried to hand the second back. "That's too much." "For the help I should have offered 3 crossings ago," he said, already swinging into his saddle. "I'll be back before sundown, Miss Zimmerman. Save a crossing for me." Then he was riding toward Tahlequah, and Fiona was left standing on the bank with 2 coins in her hand and a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She pocketed the money and began the slow process of hauling the ferry back to the western bank, where another customer was already waiting with a wagon full of supplies. The day passed in its usual blur of rope burns and aching muscles. She ferried a Cherokee family with 3 children and a dog, a traveling salesman with cases of patent medicine, 2 cowboys driving a small herd of cattle across by swimming them while she took their saddles and gear, and an elderly woman who told fortunes and insisted on reading Fiona's palm. "You'll marry before the year is out," the fortune teller said, tracing the lines on Fiona's work-roughened hand. "To a man who crosses water to find you." Fiona laughed, though the sound came out more bitter than she intended. "Madam, every man who crosses my ferry crosses water to find somewhere else. Not one of them is looking for me." "This one will be different," the old woman insisted, her eyes cloudy with cataracts but somehow still seeing. "He'll ask you to stay when staying is the hardest thing you've ever done." The words made no sense, so Fiona dismissed them and helped the woman back onto the western bank, accepting a copper penny and a sprig of dried lavender as payment. She tucked the lavender into her shirt pocket, more out of politeness than belief, and went back to waiting for the next customer. Xander Cross returned just as the sun was painting the sky orange and purple, his paint horse moving at an easy lope. Fiona was sitting on the ferry platform, dangling her feet over the edge and eating a cold biscuit left over from breakfast. She stood quickly when she saw him, brushing crumbs from her worn trousers. Her mother would have been scandalized by the men's clothing, but dresses and fairy work mixed about as well as whiskey and gunpowder. "Right on time," she said, untying the ferry rope. "Told you I would be," Xander replied, guiding his horse onto the platform. This time, he took hold of the rope without asking, and they worked together to pull the ferry across the darkening water. The evening air was cooler, bringing relief from the heat of the day, and night hawks were beginning their aerial hunting, swooping and diving after insects. Fiona found herself stealing glances at Xander as they worked, noting the way his jaw tightened with effort, the play of muscles in his forearms where he had rolled up his sleeves. "What takes you to Tahlequah every day?" she asked, more to break the silence than from real curiosity. "Business with the Cherokee Nation," he said. "I'm foreman at the Double Bar Ranch and we're negotiating grazing rights on tribal land. Takes a lot of talking and even more waiting around." "Sounds tedious." "It is," he agreed, "though the crossing is becoming the best part of my day." Fiona nearly lost her grip on the rope. She recovered quickly, hoping he had not noticed her reaction, but when she glanced over, he was watching her with something that might have been amusement in his eyes. They reached the western bank, and Xander paid his fare, again with an extra coin that she did not refuse this time. As he prepared to mount his horse, he paused and looked back at her. "Miss Zimmerman, would you mind if I brought you something tomorrow? Maybe some decent gloves for rope work?" "Those hands look like they've seen enough abuse." Fiona looked down at her palms, red and blistered despite the calluses. "I can buy my own gloves, Mr. Cross." "I'm sure you can," he said easily. "But I'd like to bring them anyway. Call it a gift from one river crosser to another." Before she could argue further, he was riding away into the gathering darkness, leaving her alone with the sound of the water and the strange feeling that her carefully ordered life was about to become very complicated. True to his word, Xander arrived the next morning with a pair of leather work gloves that fit her hands perfectly. They were expensive, she could tell, lined with soft cloth and reinforced at the palms and fingers. She accepted them with awkward thanks, unused to receiving gifts from anyone, let alone a cowboy she barely knew. "They're too fine for fairy work," she protested, even as she pulled them on and felt the immediate relief they offered her damaged hands. "Nothing's too fine for honest work," Xander said, My mother taught me that. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, he said, his expression going distant. Died of fever when I was 15. My father followed her 2 years later. Sometimes I think he just couldn't figure out how to live without her. Fiona understood that kind of loss. Her mother had died giving birth to a brother who also did not survive, leaving just Fiona and her father to manage the ferry and their small cabin on the western bank. Then her father had died, and she was truly alone except for the river and the endless stream of strangers crossing from one side to the other. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Thank you," Xander replied. "Now shall we get across this river? Those grazing rights won't negotiate themselves." They fell into a pattern over the following days. Xander would arrive mid-morning, help her pull the ferry across, and they would talk about small things. The weather, the level of the river, news from town, the price of cattle. Nothing too personal, nothing too deep, but enough that Fiona began to look forward to his crossings in a way that alarmed her. She had built her life around self-reliance and solitude, and this cowboy with his easy smile and thoughtful gifts was threatening both. On the 8th day of their acquaintance, Xander brought her a book. It was a collection of poems by Walt Whitman, bound in green cloth, slightly worn but well cared for. "I noticed you reading the other evening," he explained. "Figured you might like something new." That looked like the same newspaper you'd been reading all week. Fiona accepted the book with trembling fingers. Books were precious, expensive, hard to come by this far from big cities. She owned maybe 6 books total, most inherited from her mother, and she had read them so many times she could recite passages from memory. "I can't accept this," she said, though she was already opening the cover, already reading the inscription inside. "To Xander from Mother on your 16th birthday. May you always find beauty in words." "It was my mother's," Xander said. "But she would have wanted it to go to someone who would appreciate it. I'm not much of a poetry reader myself. Too many metaphors, not enough plain speaking." "But it was hers," Fiona said, trying to hand it back. Xander closed her fingers around the book. "And now it's yours. Please. It'll make me happy knowing it's being read instead of sitting in my saddlebag collecting dust." The touch of his hand on her sent heat racing up her arm. She pulled back quickly, clutching the book to her chest. "Thank you. This is incredibly kind." "It's nothing," Xander said, though his eyes suggested it was something more. That evening, after the last crossing of the day, Fiona sat on the porch of her small cabin and read Whitman by lamplight. The poem spoke of grass and bodies and souls, of life and death and the connections between all things. She thought about Xander Cross and his daily crossings, about the way he looked at her like she was more than just the fairy girl, more than just strong arms and determination. The next morning brought rain, a heavy downpour that turned the river choppy and dangerous. Fiona waited on the western bank, knowing most travelers would delay their journeys rather than cross in such conditions. But mid-morning, through the sheets of rain, she saw Xander approaching on his paint horse. "River's too rough," she called out as he dismounted. "I can't guarantee a safe crossing." "Then I'll wait," Xander said, leading his horse under the small shelter she had built for waiting passengers. "Those negotiations can wait a day." "You could go back to the ranch," Fiona pointed out. "Come back tomorrow when it's cleared." "I could," Xander agreed, "but then I'd miss seeing you." The words hung in the rain-soaked air between them. Fiona felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the weight of his gaze on her face. She was suddenly aware of how she must look, soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her head, wearing men's trousers and a shirt that had seen better days. "Mr. Cross." "Xander," he interrupted. "Please call me Xander." "Xander," she said, testing the name on her tongue. "Why are you really crossing every day? The grazing negotiations can't take this long. He was quiet for a moment, watching the rain, watching the swollen river, watching everything except her. Then he turned, and the expression on his face was so open, so honest that it took her breath away. "They finished the negotiations 5 days ago," he admitted. "I've been crossing because I wanted to see you. Because somewhere between the first crossing and the second, I started falling for a woman who operates a ferry alone, who has hands scarred from hard work and eyes that see right through all the nonsense people carry with them. I'm crossing because you're on the other side of the river, Fiona. That's the only reason I need." Fiona stood frozen, the rain dripping off her hat brim, her mind racing. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. The few boys who had courted her in her teenage years had been intimidated by her strength, put off by her independence. They had wanted soft girls who needed protecting, not a woman who could haul a ferry across a river and shoot a snake at 20 paces. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Xander replied. "I just wanted you to know. I'll keep crossing as long as you'll have me, and I'll understand if you want me to stop." "I don't want you to stop," Fiona heard herself say. "I look forward to your crossings. I've been looking forward to them for days now. And it scares me because I built this life alone, and I don't know how to make room for someone else in it." Xander stepped closer, close enough that she could see the water droplets caught in his eyelashes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cold rain. "Maybe you don't have to make room. Maybe we just figure it out as we go together." "I can't leave the ferry," Fiona said urgently. "I promised my father. This is all I have, all I know how to do." "I'm not asking you to leave anything," Xander said gently. "I'm just asking if I can be part of your life here, however that looks." Fiona reached out with a trembling hand and touched his face, traced the line of his jaw, felt the scratch of stubble against her palm. Xander stood perfectly still, hardly breathing, letting her explore this moment at her own pace. Then she kissed him, standing in the rain beside the swollen river, and it felt like coming home and setting sail at the same time. The rain continued through the afternoon, and Xander stayed, helping Fiona maintain the ferry equipment, checking the ropes and moorings, reinforcing the shelter against the wind. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally brushing against each other, stealing glances and smiles. When evening came and the rain showed no sign of stopping, Fiona invited him to her cabin for coffee and supper. The cabin was small but neat, one room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, and furniture her father had built with his own hands. Fiona felt suddenly self-conscious about the humble surroundings, but Xander looked around with genuine appreciation. "This is nice," he said. "Feels like a real home." "It's small," Fiona said, setting a pot of coffee on the stove. "Small doesn't mean it isn't enough," Xander replied. "I've been living in the bunkhouse at the double bar for 3 years now. This has more comfort than I've known in a long time." They ate beans and cornbread, and Fiona brought out a jar of preserves her neighbor had traded for ferry crossings. The simple meal felt momentous somehow, sharing food across her small table, talking about their lives with a new openness. Xander told her about growing up in Kansas, about learning ranch work from his father, about coming to Oklahoma Territory seeking employment after his father died. Fiona spoke about her childhood on the river, about learning the ferry from her father, about the loneliness that sometimes threatened to swallow her whole. "Don't you want more than this?" Xander asked, gesturing at the cabin, the river beyond. "A bigger life somewhere." "This is a big life," Fiona said firmly. "Maybe it doesn't look like much to other people, but I matter here. The ferry matters. People depend on me to get them across safely. That's not a small thing." "No," Xander agreed. "It's not. I'm sorry if I suggested otherwise." You want more?" Fiona asked. More than being a ranch foreman, Xander considered this, turning his coffee cup between his hands. "I want land of my own someday. A small spread enough to run some cattle, maybe raise horses, but mostly I want family. I want a wife I love and children and a reason to come home at the end of the day. Money and property, those things are fine, but they're not what makes life worth living." Fiona's heart ached with longing at his words. She had thought she was content with her solitary life, but listening to Xander speak of family and home made her realize how much she had been denying herself, how much she had built walls around her heart to protect against further loss. "That sounds like a good life," she said softly. "It does, doesn't it?" Xander reached across the table and took her hand. "Fiona, I know this is fast. I know we've only really been talking for about a week. But I'm a man who knows his own mind, and I know I want to court you properly, with your permission." "What does courting properly look like when you live at the double bar and I live here?" Fiona asked practically. "I'll keep crossing every day," Xander said. "I'll help with the ferry when you need it. We'll spend time together, get to know each other better. Maybe on Sundays, when the ferry traffic is light, we could take a ride or have a picnic. I'll write you letters even though I'll see you the next day, because that's what people do when they're courting." Fiona laughed, the sound bright and surprising in the small cabin. "You'll write me letters." "I will," Xander said seriously. "Probably terrible letters, but I'll try." "Then yes," Fiona said. "Yes, you can court me properly." The rain finally stopped near midnight, and Xander rode back to the double bar under clearing skies, promising to return in the morning. Fiona watched him go, then climbed to her sleeping loft and lay awake for hours, touching her lips where he had kissed her goodnight, soft and sweet, full of promise. The weeks that followed were the happiest Fiona had known. Xander crossed every morning and most evenings, helping with the ferry, bringing small gifts and terrible letters as promised. He brought her wildflowers picked from the prairie, a new rope that was stronger than her old one, a harmonica he had carved himself, though he freely admitted he could not play it worth a damn. Fiona found herself laughing more, smiling at nothing, singing while she worked. The regulars who crossed the ferry noticed the change. The Cherokee families teased her gently about her cowboy, and the merchants from Tahlequah asked when the wedding would be. Even the old fortune-teller crossed again, and nodded knowingly when she saw Fiona and Xander working the ferry together. "Told you," she said. "A man who crosses water to find you." On Sundays, when ferry traffic slowed to almost nothing, Xander would arrive early and they would explore the countryside together. He taught her to rope, laughing when she proved better at it than expected. She showed him the secret places along the river, the deep pools where catfish grew big as dogs, the sandbars where turtles sunned themselves, the bend where eagles nested in towering cottonwoods. "I love this place," Xander said one afternoon, sitting beside her on a blanket under the trees. "I understand now why you wouldn't want to leave it." "You could love it too," Fiona said carefully, "if you stayed." "I could," Xander agreed, "but my work is at the double bar. The foreman job is the best opportunity I've had. I can't just walk away from it." A shadow passed over Fiona's happiness. She had known this would be an issue eventually. Xander was tied to the ranch 12 miles away, and she was tied to the ferry. The river that brought them together might also be what kept them apart. "How long does a man usually work as a foreman?" she asked. "Until he saves enough to buy his own land, or until he's too old to do the work," Xander said. "I've been saving every penny I can. In another year, maybe two, I'll have enough for a down payment on a small spread." "Where?" Fiona asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Wherever land is available and affordable," Xander said. "Could be here in Oklahoma Territory, could be Kansas or Texas. I won't know until I'm ready to buy." Fiona felt the walls closing in, the old familiar panic of abandonment rising in her chest. Everyone left eventually. Her mother had died, her father had died, and now Xander would leave too, would buy land somewhere far away and expect her to follow, to give up the ferry and the promise she had made and the only identity she had ever known. "Hey," Xander said, noticing her distress. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Fiona lied, standing abruptly. "We should get back. Someone might need a crossing." They rode back in silence, and the ease between them felt strained for the first time since they had begun courting. Xander tried to talk to her, to draw her out, but Fiona kept her responses short and avoided his eyes. When he left that evening, he looked confused and hurt, and Fiona hated herself for causing it but could not seem to stop the spiral of fear consuming her. She did not sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw herself leaving the ferry, saw someone else taking over the crossing, saw her father's promise broken and his memory dishonored. But she also saw herself growing old and alone, operating the ferry until her body gave out, dying in the small cabin with no one to mourn her except the river itself. Xander arrived early the next morning, and his first words were, "We need to talk." "I know," Fiona said miserably. They sat on the ferry platform, feet dangling over the water, and Fiona forced herself to explain. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of loving you and then losing you. I'm scared of being asked to choose between you and this ferry. I'm scared that no matter what I choose, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." "Fiona," Xander said gently, "I would never ask you to choose. Whatever we build together, it has to include the ferry. I know that. I've known it from the beginning." "But you're going to buy land somewhere," Fiona said. "Land that might be hundreds of miles from here. How do we build something when we're pulled in different directions?" Xander was quiet for a long moment, staring at the water. "What if I bought land here?" he finally said, "near the ferry. We could build a house on the western bank, close enough that you could still operate the crossing. I could run cattle on the surrounding land, maybe take over some of the ferry work to give you rest. We'd be partners in all of it." Hope flared in Fiona's chest, painful and bright. "Is there land available near here?" "I don't know," Xander admitted, "but I could find out. Would that be something you'd want, a life together here?" "Yes," Fiona said, the word breaking free like a bird from a cage. "Yes, that's exactly what I want." Xander pulled her close, and she buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent. "Then that's what we'll work toward," he said. "I'll start looking into land purchases. It might take longer to save enough if the property here is expensive, but I don't care. I'll wait as long as it takes." "I'll help save," Fiona said. "The ferry brings in steady income. We can put it together." Xander repeated, smiling. "I like the sound of that." They kissed in the morning light, the river flowing beneath them, carrying away their fears and doubts. A wagon appeared on the eastern bank, waiting for passage, and they stood together to work the ferry, partners already in all the ways that mattered. The next few months were busy and full of planning. Xander made inquiries about land near the ferry and discovered that old Samuel Wright, who owned the property north of the crossing, was thinking about selling. His arthritis was getting worse, and he wanted to move closer to town where his daughter could look after him. The price was steep, but not impossible, especially if Xander and Fiona combined their savings. They met with Samuel on a warm afternoon in late summer, walking the property boundaries while the old man pointed out landmarks and shared the history of the land. There were 60 acres total, with good grass for grazing and timber enough to build a house and barn. A creek ran through the northern section, providing water year-round. The property bordered the river just upstream from the ferry, making it perfect for their needs. "It's good land," Samuel said, his voice rough with age and emotion. "I hate to see it go, but I can't work it anymore. You two would do right by it, I think. Keep it productive and cared for." "We will," Xander promised, shaking the old man's hand. "You have my word." They agreed on a price and payment terms, with Samuel willing to take half now and half in 6 months, giving Xander time to earn the remaining money. Fiona insisted on contributing her savings, over 2 years' worth of Ferry fees carefully hoarded, and together they had just enough for the first payment. That evening, standing on what would soon be their land, Xander took both of Fiona's hands in his. "I know we've been courting less than 6 months," he said, "but I know my heart, and I know I want to spend my life with you. Fiona Zimmerman, would you marry me? Would you build this life with me, here on this land with the ferry and whatever else we dream up?" Fiona felt tears streaming down her face, happy tears this time, tears of joy and relief and overwhelming love. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Xander produced a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small blue stone. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The only thing I have left of her. I had it sized down at the jeweler in Tahlequah. I hope it fits." The ring slid onto Fiona's finger perfectly, the blue stone catching the sunset light. She held her hand up, marveling at this symbol of promises and futures, then threw her arms around Xander's neck and kissed him until they were both breathless. They married on an October morning, in a small ceremony at the Cherokee Church in Tahlequah. The Reverend Johnson, who had known Fiona since childhood, performed the service, and Mrs. Johnson played hymns on the piano. The witnesses were Samuel Wright, the ranch owner where Xander worked, who gave him a bonus and time off as a wedding gift, and several of the regular ferry customers who had watched their courtship unfold across the water. Fiona wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, the best she had ever owned, and Xander wore his cleanest clothes with a vest borrowed from the ranch owner. They spoke their vows clearly and firmly, promising to love and honor until death parted them, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering cheered. The celebration was modest but joyful. Mrs. Johnson had baked a cake, and there was coffee and lemonade and enough food to feed everyone twice over. Fiona found herself laughing as the old fortune-teller, who had somehow learned of the wedding and appeared uninvited, regaled everyone with the story of predicting this very outcome months ago. "I told her she'd marry before the year was out," the old woman said, accepting a piece of cake. "To a man who crosses water to find her, and here you both are." "Here we are," Xander agreed, his arm around Fiona's waist. They spent their wedding night in Fiona's small cabin, which would be their home until they could build a house on their new land. Xander carried her over the threshold with great ceremony, even though she had lived there her entire life, and they laughed together at the absurdity and rightness of it all. They made love slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies, whispering promises in the darkness. "I love you," Fiona said, curled against Xander's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I love you too," Xander replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "My wife. My fierce, strong, beautiful wife." The word wife felt strange and wonderful. Fiona had never imagined it would apply to her, had thought she would remain the fairy girl forever, alone but free. Now she was someone's wife, and instead of feeling trapped or diminished, she felt expanded, like her life had suddenly grown to encompass more joy than she had thought possible. The next morning brought a return to work. The ferry still needed operating, and Xander still had obligations at the double bar, but now they faced these responsibilities as a married couple, as partners. Xander helped with the morning crossings before riding to the ranch, and Fiona managed the afternoon traffic alone, dreaming of the future while her hands worked the familiar ropes. In November, they broke ground on their new house. Xander hired a crew from town, and Samuel Wright, despite his arthritis, came out most days to supervise and offer advice. Fiona operated the ferry during the day and joined the construction in the evenings, helping with whatever tasks her inexperienced hands could manage. The house rose slowly from the prairie, a simple two-story structure with a wide porch and windows that would look out over the river. "It's going to be beautiful," Fiona said one evening, standing with Xander amid the sawdust and lumber. "It's going to be ours," Xander replied. "That's what makes it beautiful." They moved into the unfinished house on a cold day in January, bringing their few possessions from the cabin. There was still no glass in some of the windows, and the upstairs remained unfinished, but they had a functioning fireplace and a bedroom with a real bed frame that Xander had built himself. It felt palatial after the tiny cabin, and Fiona walked from room to empty room, imagining how they would fill these spaces with life and love. Winter settled over Oklahoma territory with unusual cold, and the river froze for the first time in years. Ferry traffic slowed to almost nothing, giving Fiona time to help with the house finishing work. She learned to hang curtains and plaster walls, to arrange furniture and make a house into a home. Xander spent his free time building a barn and corral, preparing for the cattle he planned to buy in the spring. On a snowy evening in February, Fiona realized her monthly courses were late. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes that might be dashed, but when another week passed and still nothing came, she finally told Xander. "A baby," he said, his face cycling through surprise and joy and fear in rapid succession. "We're going to have a baby." "I think so," Fiona said. "It's early yet, things could change, but yes, I believe so." Xander picked her up and spun her around, laughing, then set her down quickly and anxiously. "Should I have done that? Is spinning bad for babies?" "I don't think one spin will hurt," Fiona said, smiling at his concern. "But maybe we can avoid any more acrobatics for the next several months." They told no one for the first few months, keeping the secret close while Fiona's body slowly changed. She continued operating the ferry through the spring, even as morning sickness made the early hours miserable. Xander worried constantly, wanting her to rest more, to let him handle all the ferry crossings, but Fiona refused to be treated like an invalid. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him. "I'm strong and healthy, the work won't hurt me or the child." "I know," Xander said, "but I can't help worrying. You're everything to me, Fiona, you and this baby." His love and concern touched her deeply, but she also needed him to trust her judgment about her own body and capabilities. They found a compromise. Xander would handle the heavy morning crossings before going to the ranch, and Fiona would manage the lighter afternoon traffic. On days when the river ran high or dangerous, she would wait for his help rather than crossing alone. By summer, Fiona's pregnancy was obvious to everyone who crossed the ferry. The regular customers offered congratulations and advice. The Cherokee grandmothers brought herbs and remedies, and Mrs. Johnson from the church organized a quilting bee to make baby blankets. Fiona found herself embraced by a community she had not realized she was part of, women who had watched her grow up and operate the ferry, and now celebrated this next chapter of her life. "When is the baby due, Mrs. Johnson asked, examining Fiona's swollen belly with an experienced eye. "September, I think," Fiona said. "Maybe late August." "You'll need help," Mrs. Johnson said firmly. "Babies don't wait for convenient timing, and you can't be operating a ferry while in labor." I'll arrange for some of the church women to take turns staying with you as the time approaches." Fiona wanted to protest that she could manage alone, but she knew that would be foolish. Childbirth was dangerous, even for healthy women, and she needed to think of the baby's welfare as well as her own pride. "Thank you," she said. "I'd appreciate that." Xander left his foreman position at the Double Bar in August, telling the owner he needed to be closer to home with the baby coming soon. It was a financial sacrifice, losing the steady wages, but their cattle operation was starting to show profit, and Xander had been making money breaking horses for neighboring ranchers. Between the ferry income and the ranch work, they could manage. "Besides," Xander said, "I'm not missing the birth of my first child because I'm 12 miles away chasing cattle." The baby came on a warm night in early September, arriving faster than anyone expected. Fiona's labor started just after sunset, and by midnight she was holding a squalling infant boy with dark hair and strong lungs. Xander cut the cord with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, while Mrs. Johnson cleaned the baby and made sure Fiona was recovering properly. "What will you name him?" Mrs. Johnson asked, placing the bundled baby in Fiona's arms. Fiona looked at Xander and they shared a smile. They had discussed names endlessly over the past months. "Thomas," Fiona said. "Thomas William Cross. Thomas for Xander's father, William for mine." "It's perfect," Xander said, touching his son's tiny hand with one finger. "He's perfect." The days following Thomas's birth blurred together in a haze of feedings and diaper changes and profound exhaustion. Fiona had thought operating the ferry was hard work, but caring for a newborn proved to be something else entirely. Xander helped as much as he could, walking the floor with Thomas in the middle of the night, changing diapers, bringing Fiona food and water while she nursed. "I don't know how women do this alone," Fiona said one morning, so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. "You're not alone," Xander reminded her. "You'll never be alone again. We're a family now." The ferry presented a challenge with a newborn in the house. Fiona tried returning to work after 2 weeks, bringing Thomas with her in a sling, but the constant crying and feeding schedule made consistent ferry operation nearly impossible. For the first time in her life, Fiona faced the reality that she could not do everything herself. "We need to hire help," Xander said gently, "just temporarily until Thomas is older and easier to manage." "Who would we hire?" Fiona asked. "Not many people know how to operate a ferry." "I can teach someone," Xander said. "It's not that complicated. You taught me in a single crossing, remember?" They put out word in Tahlequah that they were looking for ferry help, and within a week, a young Cherokee man named Samuel Runner appeared at their door. He was 19, quiet and strong, looking for work after his family's farm had been sold to white settlers. Xander spent 3 days training him on the ferry operation, and Samuel proved to be a quick learner with a good work ethic. "I'll handle the weekday crossings," Samuel offered. "You can still work weekends if you want or take over again when the baby's older. Whatever suits your family." The arrangement felt strange at first. The ferry had been Fiona's sole responsibility for so long that watching someone else operate, it felt like betrayal. But Thomas needed her, Xander needed her, and she was learning that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom. Samuel operated the ferry with care and competence. Customers continued crossing safely, and Fiona had time to heal and bond with her baby. The months passed in a sweet blur of firsts. Thomas's first smile, his first laugh, his first tooth. Christmas came, and they celebrated in their house with a small tree and homemade gifts. Xander carved a wooden horse for Thomas, who was too young to appreciate it but would treasure it later. Fiona knitted everyone's socks, practical gifts that were received with enthusiasm as winter winds howled outside. "This is the best Christmas I've ever had," Xander said, holding Thomas while Fiona dozed by the fire. "Even though we're not wealthy?" Fiona asked sleepily. "Even though the house still isn't completely finished and we're eating simple food and your socks already have a hole in them, especially because of all that," Xander replied. "We built this life with our own hands, Fiona. This house, this land, this family. That's worth more than all the wealth in the world." By spring, Thomas was sitting up and babbling, and Fiona felt ready to return to Ferry work part-time. She and Samuel worked out a schedule where they each operated the ferry 3 days a week, with Sundays off for both of them. It meant less income than full-time operation, but it also meant Fiona could be present for Thomas's daily discoveries and milestones. Xander's cattle operation continued growing. He bought 6 more head in the spring, building the herd slowly and carefully. He also started breaking horses more seriously, developing a reputation for patient, effective training methods. Ranchers from as far as 50 miles away brought him difficult horses, and Xander worked with each one until they were reliable mounts. "You're getting famous," Fiona teased one evening, watching him work with a particularly stubborn mare. "Just doing good work," Xander replied. "Same as you with the ferry." Life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and good. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable. The house was finished, the barn was full, Thomas was growing strong and healthy. Fiona had feared that marriage and motherhood would somehow diminish her, would reduce her to being just someone's wife and mother. But instead she found that her identity had expanded to encompass all these roles. She was still the ferry operator, still strong and capable, but now she was also a wife and mother, and those identities enriched rather than limited her. On their second wedding anniversary, Xander brought Fiona to the riverbank where they had first crossed together. Thomas was with Mrs. Johnson for the evening, giving them rare time alone. They sat on the bank as the sun set, watching the water flow past, remembering. "Do you regret it?" Xander asked. "Marrying me, sharing the ferry, all of it?" "Not for a single moment," Fiona said honestly. "Do you regret giving up your foreman position, tying yourself to this place?" "This place is freedom, not confinement," Xander said. "I get to work my own land, raise my own cattle, go to sleep beside the woman I love every night. That's not sacrifice. That's grace." They made love there on the riverbank, under the emerging stars, with the sound of water flowing past. It was different from their early desperate passion, deeper and richer now, layered with shared history and trust, and the everyday intimacies of building a life together. More years passed, marked by the growth of their son and their land. Thomas learned to walk and then run, constantly exploring, constantly curious. He loved the ferry, loved the water, loved watching his mother work the ropes with her strong arms. By the time he was 4, he was begging to help, and Fiona let him hold the rope under her supervision, teaching him the same way her father had taught her. "Will Thomas operate the ferry someday?" Xander asked, watching his son's obvious joy in the work. "If he wants to," Fiona said. "But only if he wants to. I won't burden him with obligation the way I was burdened." "It wasn't a burden for you," Xander observed. "Was it?" Fiona considered this. "No," she admitted. "It was a gift. I just didn't always see it that way." When Thomas was 5, Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. The news brought joy mixed with anxiety. The first pregnancy and birth had gone well, but she knew women who had not been so fortunate with subsequent children. She was also older now, 28, and while not ancient, she was aware that childbirth carried risks at any age. "Everything will be fine," Xander said, though she could see the worry in his eyes. "You're strong, the baby will be strong." We'll get through this together, just like we get through everything. This pregnancy was harder than the first. Fiona was more exhausted, more uncomfortable, and Thomas required constant supervision and energy. Samuel took over more of the ferry work, and Xander hired a girl from town to help with housework and watching Thomas. Fiona hated feeling helpless, hated needing so much assistance, but she forced herself to accept it for the baby's sake. The second baby, a daughter they named Frances Rose, arrived in late winter during a snowstorm that nearly prevented Mrs. Johnson from reaching them in time. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Fiona genuinely feared she might not survive. But finally, Frances emerged with a lusty cry, perfect and healthy, and Fiona held her daughter with shaking arms and overwhelming relief. "A daughter," Xander said wonderingly, touching the baby's dark hair. "We have a daughter." Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her constantly, bringing her his favorite toys as gifts. He appointed himself her protector, very serious about his new role. Watching her two children together, Fiona felt a contentment so profound it sometimes brought tears to her eyes. This was what happiness looked like, she realized. Not grand adventures or excitement, but simple, ordinary moments with the people you loved. Recovery from Frances's birth took longer than recovery from Thomas's had. Fiona developed a fever that lasted nearly a week, and the doctor from Tahlequah had to be summoned. He prescribed rest and medicine, warning Xander that another pregnancy might be dangerous for Fiona. "No more babies," Xander said firmly after the doctor left. "2 children is perfect. I won't risk you for the possibility of more." "I'm fine," Fiona protested weakly from the bed. "Women have many children, it's normal." "Not for us," Xander said. "I need you, Fiona. Thomas and Frances need you. We're done growing our family this way." Fiona wanted to argue, but she was too exhausted, and in her heart she knew he was right. 2 children felt like enough, like completion. She let herself rest and heal, trusting Xander and Samuel and the hired girl to manage everything she usually controlled. Spring came, and with it, Fiona's return to health and strength. She resumed ferry work 2 days a week, finding that the physical labor helped her regain her fitness after childbirth. Frances proved to be an easier baby than Thomas had been, content to sleep in her sling while Fiona worked. Thomas, now 6, started attending the small school in Tahlequah, riding across the ferry every morning with other children from the area. The years continued their steady march. The cattle herd grew to 30 head, enough to provide solid income from yearly sales. Xander's horse training business expanded, and he built a second corral and a covered training arena. They saved money carefully, investing in improvements to the property and setting aside funds for the children's futures. Thomas grew tall and strong, favoring his father in looks but inheriting his mother's determination and work ethic. He learned ferry operation thoroughly, able to handle crossings alone by age 10. Frances was quieter, more studious, preferring books to outdoor work, but still capable and strong when needed. Both children were fluent in Cherokee as well as English, having learned from Samuel and the Cherokee families who crossed the ferry regularly. On Thomas's 12th birthday, Xander took him to look at a piece of land adjacent to their property. Old Samuel Wright had passed away, and his daughter was selling his remaining holdings. The parcel was small, just 20 acres, but it bordered their ranch and would allow them to expand the herd. "What do you think?" Xander asked Thomas. "Should we buy it? Can we afford it?" Thomas asked practically. "Just barely," Xander admitted, "but it's good land and opportunities like this don't come often." "Then we should buy it," Thomas said. "We can make it work." They purchased the land, taking out a loan that would require tight budgeting for the next several years. But the expanded grazing meant they could run 50 head of cattle comfortably, and the increased income from larger yearly sales would offset the loan payments. It was a calculated risk, but one that felt right. Frances announced at age 10 that she wanted to be a teacher. She had been helping the younger children at school with their lessons and discovered she loved explaining concepts and watching understanding dawn in their eyes. Fiona and Xander encouraged her ambition, knowing it would require money for teacher training that they did not currently have but could save toward. "She could be anything she wants," Xander said proudly. "Smart as a whip, that girl." "She gets it from you," Fiona teased. "She gets it from both of us," Xander corrected. "You're the smartest person I know, Fiona Cross." The nickname made Fiona smile. After nearly 13 years of marriage, she still sometimes thought of herself as Fiona Zimmerman, ferry operator, independent and alone. But she was Fiona Cross now, and that identity felt as natural as breathing. She was a wife, a mother, a businesswoman, a member of a community. All these roles fit together, creating a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. When Fiona turned 35, Xander threw her a surprise party, inviting everyone who had been part of their journey. Samuel Runner, who still operated the ferry several days a week and had become a dear friend. Mrs. Johnson and her husband, who had witnessed their wedding and baptized both their children. The neighboring ranchers and their families. The regular ferry customers who had watched their family grow. Even the old fortune teller, now ancient and nearly blind but still sharp-tongued and insightful. "I told you," the fortune teller said, gripping Fiona's hand. "A man who crosses water to find you, and you stayed. Both of you stayed and built something beautiful." "We did," Fiona agreed, looking around at the gathered crowd at the house and land and family they had created. "Thank you for seeing it when I couldn't." That night, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, Fiona and Xander sat on their porch watching the moonlight reflect off the river. The ferry sat quiet at its mooring, waiting for tomorrow's crossings, a constant in their ever-changing lives. "Did you ever imagine this?" Fiona asked. "When you first started crossing the ferry, did you imagine it would lead here?" "I imagined you," Xander said honestly. "I saw you hauling that ferry alone, so strong and fierce and beautiful, and I imagined loving you. Everything else just followed naturally from that." "I was terrified," Fiona admitted. "Terrified of loving you, of losing the ferry, of change itself. I thought my life was set, that I would be alone forever. And now I can't imagine any other life," Fiona said. "This is everything I never knew I wanted." The years continued their progression, bringing challenges and joys in equal measure. A drought in Frances's 14th year tested their cattle operation, forcing them to sell more head than planned to avoid overgrazing their land. A flood the following spring damaged the ferry platform, requiring expensive repairs. Thomas fell from a horse and broke his arm, giving everyone a scare. Frances received a scholarship to the teacher training program in Tahlequah, fulfilling her dream and making her parents proud beyond measure. Through it all, the ferry continued operating, connecting the banks of the Arkansas River, carrying people and goods and dreams across the water. Fiona worked it less as the years passed, transitioning more responsibilities to Thomas and Samuel, but she never fully retired. The ferry was in her blood, part of her identity, as essential as breathing. Xander's hair began graying at the temples, and Fiona found silver threads in her own dark hair. They laughed about growing old together, making jokes about creaky knees and failing eyesight, but underneath, the humor was profound gratitude that they had been granted this time together. So many couples they knew had been separated by death or disaster or simple incompatibility, but they remained, steady and strong as the river itself. Thomas announced his engagement at 20 to a Cherokee girl named Martha who had grown up crossing the ferry. She was smart and kind and loved the river as much as Thomas did, making her perfect for a life that would inevitably involve the family business. The wedding was large and joyous, bringing together both families and much of the community. "Your son is married," Fiona said to Xander that night, feeling the weight of time's passage. "How did we get old enough to have married children?" "We're not old," Xander protested. "We're experienced." "I'm 43, Fiona said. "That's old." "You're beautiful," Xander corrected, pulling her close. "And I love you exactly as much today as I did when I first crossed your ferry all those years ago. More, actually, because now I know all the small pieces of you that make up the whole." They made love slowly, tenderly, bodies that knew each other so well that words were unnecessary. Afterwards, Fiona lay in Xander's arms and felt perfectly content, perfectly complete. Frances graduated from teacher training and took a position at the Tahlequah school, teaching children to read and write and think for themselves. She lived in town during the week but came home on weekends, and the house felt empty without her constant presence. Fiona struggled with this transition, missing her daughter, but Frances was living her dream, and that brought its own joy. Thomas and Martha built a house on the property, a smaller version of Fiona and Xander's home, positioned near the ferry for convenience. They took over most of the ferry operation, allowing Fiona to fully retire at 45. Samuel Runner also retired, moving to live with his daughter in Tahlequah, ending an association that had lasted more than 20 years. "The ferry is in good hands," Samuel said on his last day. "Thomas learned well from you." "Thank you," Fiona said, embracing the man who had become family, "for everything, for all the years of partnership and friendship." "It was my honor," Samuel replied. "The ferry brought me to you and Xander when I most needed purpose and community." I'll never forget that. Watching Samuel leave, Fiona felt the weight of endings and new beginnings. The ferry would continue, operated now by her son and his wife, but her active role was finished. It felt strange and unsettling, like losing a piece of herself, but also liberating. She was free now to pursue other interests, to rest when tired, to travel if she wanted. "What do you want to do now?" Xander asked. "You've spent your whole life tied to that ferry. Now you can do anything." Fiona thought about this question deeply. What did she want? She wanted to spend time with Xander, to know him in ways that years of shared labor had not allowed. She wanted to visit Frances in town more often, to be present for her daughter's life. She wanted to help Martha adjust to ferry life, to pass on the knowledge and skills she had accumulated over decades. She wanted to read all the books she had never had time for, to learn new things, to maybe even travel beyond Oklahoma territory and see mountains and oceans. "I want everything," she said finally. "Everything we haven't had time for while we were building this life. Can we do that?" "We can do whatever you want," Xander promised. They took their first real trip together when Fiona was 46, traveling by train to Colorado to see the Rocky Mountains. It was strange and wonderful to be away from the river, away from the constant demands of work and family. They hiked in the mountains, stayed in a hotel with indoor plumbing and electricity, ate in restaurants, and acted like newlyweds rediscovering each other. "I love this," Fiona said, standing on a mountain peak with wind whipping her hair. "But I also miss home." "Me too," Xander admitted. "As wonderful as this is, nothing compares to our land, our river, our family." They returned home after 2 weeks, eager to be back in familiar surroundings. Thomas and Martha had managed perfectly without them, and Fiona felt a mixture of pride and obsolescence. She was no longer essential to the ferry's operation, which was exactly as it should be but still required adjustment. Frances married at 25 to another teacher named David who shared her passion for education. They planned to stay in Tahlequah, where teaching positions were available for both of them. The wedding was smaller than Thomas's had been, more intimate, reflecting Frances's quieter nature. Fiona cried through the entire ceremony, overwhelmed by the passage of time and the bittersweet joy of watching her children build their own lives. "Both our children are married and settled," Fiona said to Xander afterwards. "We're grandparent age now." "Not quite yet," Xander said. "But probably soon. Are you ready for that?" "I don't know," Fiona admitted. "It seems impossible that I'm old enough to be a grandmother, but also I can't wait to meet them, whoever they turn out to be." Martha gave birth to the first grandchild 10 months after her wedding, a boy they named William after both his great-grandfathers. Fiona held the tiny infant and marveled at the continuation of family, at the way life cycled forward through generations. This child would grow up knowing the ferry, learning its operation just as Thomas had, just as Fiona herself had. The business she had worked so hard to maintain would continue beyond her lifetime, carried forward by descendants she would never meet. "He's perfect," Fiona whispered, touching William's tiny hand. "Just like his father was," Xander said, standing beside her. "Just like you are." More grandchildren followed. Thomas and Martha had 3 children in total, and Frances and David had 2. The house that had felt too quiet after the children left now filled regularly with grandchildren, their laughter and chaos bringing new energy. Fiona found that being a grandmother was different from being a mother, more relaxed and playful, with all the joy and less of the constant worry and responsibility. Xander turned 60, and the ranch threw him a birthday party that lasted until dawn. He was still strong and active, still breaking horses and managing cattle, but Fiona could see him slowing slightly, moving more carefully, resting more often. It frightened her, this evidence of mortality, but she pushed the fear away and focused on gratitude for each day they had together. "I'm getting old," Xander said one evening, rubbing his aching back after a long day. "We both are," Fiona replied. "But we're doing it together, and that makes it bearable." "More than bearable," Xander corrected. "I wouldn't change a single day of this life we've built." They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary with a party that brought together 4 generations. Their grandchildren performed a play they had written about the ferry and how their grandparents met, complete with costumes and terrible acting that charmed everyone. Looking around at the gathered crowd, at the family and friends who made up their community, Fiona felt overwhelmed with gratitude and love. 30 years, she said to Xander as they danced slowly under the stars. 3 decades of marriage. Best decision I ever made, Xander said. Crossing that ferry every day until I got the courage to tell you how I felt. Best decision I ever made was saying yes when you asked me to stay, Fiona replied. To stay with you to build this life. I could have let fear win. I'm so glad I didn't. Me too, Xander said, holding her close. More years passed, bringing the inevitable challenges of aging. Xander developed arthritis in his hands, making rope work and horse training difficult. Fiona's knees grew troublesome, making stairs a challenge. They adapted, adjusting their activities, accepting help from their children, learning to be graceful about limitations. Frances's oldest child, a daughter named Fiona after her grandmother, announced she wanted to study at university, the first in the family to pursue higher education. Everyone celebrated this achievement, proud of how far the family had come in just 2 generations. Young Fiona would study literature and history, subjects that had been luxuries in her grandmother's youth, but were now accessible to a determined young woman. Thomas took over the ranch operation completely as Xander could no longer manage the physical demands. Martha and Thomas ran both the ferry and the cattle business with competence and care, maintaining the legacy while also modernizing where it made sense. They purchased a motor vehicle, one of the new automobiles that were becoming more common, using it to transport goods and drive to Tahlequah faster than a horse could manage. "Times are changing," Fiona observed, watching the automobile navigate their rough road. "Everything is different from when we started." "The important things stay the same," Xander said. "Family, land, honest work, love, those don't change no matter what vehicles people drive." On their 40th wedding anniversary, they were both 70, white-haired and slow-moving but still sharp in mind and deep in love. The celebration was quieter this time, just family, gathered in the house they had built together 4 decades earlier. The grandchildren were teenagers and young adults now, the great-grandchildren small and rambunctious. 4 generations under one roof, all connected by the love between a ferry operator and a cowboy who had crossed daily until he found the courage to ask her to stay. 40 years, Fiona said, sitting beside Xander on the porch swing they had installed 20 years earlier. "That's a long time." "Not long enough," Xander said. "I'd take 40 more if we could have them." "Me too," Fiona agreed, lacing her fingers through his. "Though I suppose we should be grateful for what we've been given. Not many people get this much happiness." They watched the sun set over the river, the same view they had watched thousands of times before. The ferry sat at its mooring, ready for tomorrow's crossings, still connecting the banks, still serving the community. Beyond it, the land they had purchased and improved stretched toward the horizon, dotted with cattle and horses, and the second house where Thomas and Martha lived with their youngest child, the older two having moved to their own places. "You remember the first time I crossed?" Xander asked. "You looked so fierce, hauling that ferry alone, determined to do it all yourself." "I remember thinking you watched me too much," Fiona admitted. "It made me self-conscious." "I couldn't help it," Xander said. "You were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Strong and capable and completely yourself. I fell in love before we even spoke." "I was terrified of you," Fiona confessed. "Terrified of what you represented. Change, vulnerability, the possibility of loss. I had built such high walls around my heart." "I'm glad I kept crossing until you let me in," Xander said. "I'm glad you were patient enough to wait," Fiona replied. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged. Inside the house, they could hear their family cleaning up from the anniversary dinner, laughing and talking, living the life that Fiona and Xander had made possible through their love and hard work. "No regrets?" Xander asked quietly. "Not a single one," Fiona said firmly. "This life, this family, this love. It's been more than I ever dreamed possible. Thank you for crossing that river. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for asking me to stay." "Thank you for saying yes," Xander replied. "Thank you for being brave enough to let love in. Thank you for building this beautiful life with me." They kissed in the darkness, 2 old people who had loved each other across 4 decades and raised a family and built a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The river flowed past, constant and eternal, carrying its waters toward distant oceans, connecting past and present and future in its endless journey. The years that followed were quieter, slower, marked by increasing limitations and the acceptance that comes with age. But they were still rich years, still full of love and family and small daily joys. Watching great-grandchildren learn to walk, sharing meals with children and grandchildren, sitting together on the porch in the evenings. These simple moments made up a life, Fiona realized. Not grand adventures or dramatic events, but the accumulation of days spent with people you loved, doing work that mattered, in a place you called home. Xander passed away in his sleep at 74, his heart simply stopping after a lifetime of steady beating. Fiona woke beside him on a spring morning and knew immediately that he was gone, that the great love of her life had left her behind. The grief was crushing, overwhelming, a physical pain in her chest that made breathing difficult. After 50 years together, she had forgotten how to be a single person rather than half of a whole. The funeral drew people from across Oklahoma and beyond, testament to the life Xander had lived and the community he had served. Fiona sat surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, grateful for their support, but feeling utterly alone despite the crowd. They buried him in the small cemetery outside Tahlequah, and Fiona stood at the graveside long after everyone else had left, saying a final goodbye to the man who had crossed a river daily until he found the courage to ask her to stay. The months after Xander's death were the hardest of Fiona's life. She moved through each day mechanically, finding no joy in things that had once brought pleasure. The house felt too big and too empty without his presence. She stopped eating properly, stopped caring for herself, stopped seeing the point of continuing when the person who had made life worth living was gone. It was Thomas who pulled her back from the edge of that dark place. He came to the house one evening and found her sitting in the darkness, unmoving, barely alive despite still breathing. "Mom," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair, "you have to keep living. Dad wouldn't want this for you." "I don't know how to live without him," Fiona whispered. "We were together for 50 years. He was everything." "He was a huge part of your life," Thomas agreed, "but he wasn't everything. You were strong and capable before you met him. You operated that ferry alone for years. You survived losses before. You can survive this too." "I don't want to," Fiona said honestly. "I know," Thomas said, "but you have to anyway. For us, your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we still need you, we still love you, please don't give up." His words reached through the fog of grief, reminding her that while Xander was gone, she still had family, still had purpose. Slowly, painfully, she began the work of rebuilding a life alone. She started eating again, caring for herself, engaging with the world. The grief never left, but it became manageable, a constant companion rather than a crushing weight. Fiona returned to the ferry at 76, not to operate it but to sit beside the river and remember. Thomas found her there one afternoon, staring at the water with tears streaming down her face. "This is where we met," she said without looking at him. "This ferry brought your father to me. It gave me everything I have. My entire life came from this crossing." "It's a good legacy," Thomas said, sitting beside her. "The ferry is still running, still serving people, still connecting the community. You and Dad built something that will last beyond both of you." "I just miss him so much," Fiona said. "Every day, every moment I miss him." "I know," Thomas said, putting his arm around her. "But he's not really gone, Mom. He's in this land, this river, this family. Everything we are came from what you built together. That's immortality in a way. He'll live on through us and our children and their children." The words brought comfort, and Fiona leaned against her son, grateful for his strength and wisdom. She realized that while Xander was gone, his legacy remained in their children, in the values they had instilled, in the love they had modeled. Death had taken him from her, but it could not erase what they had created together. Fiona lived another 6 years after Xander's passing, dying peacefully at 82, surrounded by 4 generations of family. In those final years, She found a kind of peace, a acceptance of life cycles and her place in them. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories of the past, ensuring the family history was preserved. She put her affairs in order, divided her possessions with care, made sure everyone knew they were loved. On her last day, lying in the bed she had shared with Xander for 50 years, Fiona called her children to her side. Thomas and Frances came immediately, their own hair now gray, their own faces marked by time. "I want you to know," she said, her voice weak but clear, "that I lived the most beautiful life. Your father and I built something rare and precious together. This land, this family, this love. Take care of it all. Pass it on to your children and their children. And remember that love is always worth the risk, always worth the pain of eventual loss. I would choose your father 1,000 times over, even knowing how it would end." "We will, Mom," Thomas promised, tears streaming down his face. "We'll take care of everything. And we'll tell your story," Frances added, "about the ferry operator and the cowboy who crossed daily until he asked her to stay, about how you built a life and a family from love and hard work. Your grandchildren and great-grandchildren will know what you did, who you were." "That's all I can ask," Fiona said, closing her eyes. "I'm ready now. I've been ready for a while. I want to see him again." She died that evening as the sun set over the river, the same river that had defined her life and brought her love. They buried her beside Xander in the Tahlequah cemetery, their names together on a shared headstone, Xander Cross and Fiona Zimmerman Cross. Beloved husband and wife, parents and grandparents, pioneers of the Arkansas River Ferry. The ferry continued operating long after Fiona's death, passed down through generations of the Cross family. It remained a vital connection between the banks, serving the community, carrying forward the legacy that Fiona and Xander had built together. The house they had constructed still stood, occupied now by Thomas and Martha in their old age, then by their children, each generation adding their own touches while respecting the foundation. Years turned to decades, and the story of Fiona and Xander became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and at gatherings. The ferry girl who operated the crossing alone until a cowboy started crossing daily, bringing gifts and kindness until she agreed to let love in. How they had built a life together from nothing but determination and love, creating a legacy that lasted generations. How they had shown that choosing love, choosing to stay, choosing to build rather than remaining safe and alone, was always the right choice. The river continued flowing, carrying its waters toward distant oceans, eternal and unchanging. And somewhere in its current, in the rhythm of its flow, lived the memory of a ferry crossing back and forth, connecting not just banks but hearts, bringing a lonely operator and a determined cowboy together in a love that had transformed both their lives and rippled forward through time to touch generations yet unborn.